For today, we're going to do a small little physiognomy check. Physiognomy is the study from several cultures globally to see what kind of personality traits can show up or reflect in your facial features. So we're going to go sort of section by section, recapping what different parts of your face mean or reflect of your personality. Could mean, might mean. There's different interpretations of physiognomy. There's the Chinese interpretation of physiognomy, the Greek interpretation. There's the more modern English interpretation of physiognomy. The Greeks typically likened people to animals, and they would then compare people's personality traits to that of an animal. So if you had a facial feature or a facial structure that was more compatible to a lion, a monkey, or a mouse, then they would ascribe those type of traits to you. In Chinese physiognomy or Chinese facial readings, they typically go pretty in depth, including looking at little facial moles and whatnot to indicate what kind of honor or wealth you might have, whatever fortune you might have. This one's a bit more general. This one's a very simplistic take on physiognomy. So we're going to start off very, very simple. For today, we're just going to examine your head shape. Then we'll examine your eye shape, your nose shape, your lip shape, and what they indicate about you. Okay? We'll even examine your ears and what they reflect about you. So, for your head shape, we have 6 different options, 6 different varieties. I am going to measure your head shape real quick. I'm going to use just a sort of quick little measuring trick to kind of get it done quickly. So, I'm going to measure your forehead out to see how long or how wide it is. Okay. And now for your chin shape, I'm going to just measure how long that is. Okay. Your forehead is a little bit wider than your chin. I'm also going to measure the length of your face. So let's see if this kind of matches up with the width of your face, or if it's quite longer than the width of your face. Okay. Your face is a bit longer than the width of your face. So you have more of a oblong face, or a long and thin face. An oblong face in this more simplistic chart, take it with a grain of salt, indicates characters or qualities that are a bit more tolerant, but yet stubborn, hopeful, and hardworking. Now, the simplistic chart won't go into the details of it, but because your forehead, which is supposed to be on average 4 finger lengths wide, yours is about 5 finger lengths wide, your face is measured out in 3 sections. So this is the more cerebral section of your face, obviously. The middle section, I believe, is the more practical section of your face, and the lower third is the more idealistic version of your face. But the top third outweighs the bottom 2/3. So that reflects that you're a bit more of a cerebral person. Thus, that might indicate why it is that you're both stubborn yet tolerant, which is a balance that exists where if you are someone who is open-minded enough to play with certain ideas, have curiosity to figure out how things work, but also not so foolish enough to go with bad ideas or to affirm negative concepts, then that kind of reflects that balance that someone with an oblong face might possess. Now, typically people with oblong faces are also very cooperative at work. They tend to be more on the punctual, organized, sort sort of determined wavelength. And their hopes, as it says that it's hopeful as well, is typically towards a vision of getting things done that you're supposed to get done. And then from that sort of responsibility, you're then able to achieve a peaceful domestic life. Now, that's more so your face shape. This applies to both men and women. Typically with a man, you're going to find that they're going to be a little more stubborn and hardworking, based just off of the testosterone surging in their body. Meanwhile, with a woman, she will tend to be a little more hopeful and a little more tolerant, a little more idealistic. Now, we're going to examine the other 5 head shapes. The next one is a round face shape. A round face shape is pretty much equidistant in its proportions. So it's going to have a very soft chin, unlike a squared face where it has very strong jawline. A round face will have a very soft chin, very round cheeks, and the distance or the length from the forehead to the chin will be pretty much equidistant between the ears. So, a round face, which is not your head shape, would be jovial and humorous. Typically, this is a moon-informed head shape. This is a very lunar-informed head shape. Ironically, it's shaped like the moon, too. They are very confident and optimistic. They are enthusiastic, kind and easy living formula. So they tend to be very maternal. They tend to be very caring and loving. If a round head shape is found on a man, he might be a little more self-conscious. He might be someone who kind of hangs out in the background. If it's found on a woman, she tends to be a bit more maternal and affirming, but also could be prone towards more emotional outbursts as well. The next face shape we're going to examine is the oval face shape. This is like the perfect face shape to have as a woman. As a man, typically the best one to have is probably more of a square face, but not too square, because then you have to really match, your glasses and hairstyle to it. But the oval face shape is much like the round face shape, but it's a little bit longer in its length, so it's not so equidistant. The width or the length between the forehead and the chin is longer than the distance between the ears. So, the oval face shape, as previously mentioned, enhances a beauty in a woman. It signifies a refined tendency in a man. So typically when a man is found to have an oval face shape, it can kind of give him a Dorian Gray, kind of like Evelyn Waugh kind of elegance, where they are someone who probably has a more aristocratic lifestyle. Typically when someone's in a very high testosterone, high stress environment, their face shape naturally becomes more squared out due to the hormones surging in their face. But when a man finds himself in a more domestic environment, his facial features, particularly his jaw and bone structure, will soften out, including his eyes. So an oval face shape reflects reflects a man, if it's found in a man, who's a bit more aristocratic. In a woman, it's just generally seen as a very balanced face shape. It signifies someone who is friendly and loving, and it also indicates someone who has a strong sense of individuality. So, for example, someone with a round face will find it a bit difficult to assert their individuality until they've reached a melting point, if they're a woman, where then they have an emotional outburst that people kind of get surprised by. Or if they're a man, they'll probably usually remove themselves quickly from an environment and never want to go into that environment again. Meanwhile, someone with an oval face shape will probably be more likely to kind of assert their boundaries or individuality pretty reasonably throughout their engagements. The next face shape we're going to discuss is a very broad, sort of rectangular face shape. This one's a bit more found in people who are probably of like a peasant Anglo-Saxon phenotype, or perhaps of a more, it's usually found, it's not that common, let's say. So, a broad face indicates someone who is broadly of mind and steadiness. So typically, unlike the oblong face, which is what you possess, a broad face, since their forehead in the third section is smaller than the middle third. The middle third will be the largest in their face shape. The top third will be small, so they're not going to be someone who's going to be very cerebral or open to abstract concepts. They're going to be someone who's going to be very practically guided, someone who's grounded in reality, in what is immediately important in their life. So they're going to be very steady, and they're going to be very sort of rooted in what is immediately important. So tasks, assignments, roles, you name it. They can be tolerant and benevolent. They are very good neighbors. They can be very, they can overlook some slights, but I could also imagine them kind of being a town gossip, depending on who they're around, mostly because of that lower or that smaller upper third. And then they do have a forgive and forget policy where nothing is truly too grievous for them to not overcome, mostly because what's important to them is just what is practical. So even if they might gossip, due to that bottom third also not necessarily being the smallest either, even if they have a tendency to gossip, they're not going to really feel the weight of it, because it's just not something they're going to spend too much time thinking about. They have a more of a laugh more, worry less approach to life. That's where the gossiping comes from. They have more of a socialized and party-oriented mind, a jovial mindset, where they would like to enjoy whatever they can when they're not busy at task. Now, the next face shape is the square face shape. The square face shape is equidistant from the forehead to the chin and from ear to ear, but they're all equidistant, and every third is kind of in balance. But the jawline is much stronger than that of the oval face shape, where the cheeks are more prominent and the jawline is soft. In the square face shape, the cheeks are more sallow and the jawline is more apparent. A square face shape is ideal in a man because it tends to indicate someone who's a bit more of a go-getter, and in a woman it will also reflect determination, possessing action and the speed, so accomplishing what you need to do with efficiency, because there's sort of like a competitive spirit when it comes to that sort of bone structure. It's a hunter bone structure. A go-getter, an achiever, this is someone who's dependable, where if you assign them a task, they're going to do such a good job that you would even have to worry about them becoming your superior in whatever context you might be in, just ambitiously. Very handsome head shape. And lastly, we have the pear-shaped face. The pear-shaped face tends to be the face shape where, although this isn't a complete chart because they don't feature the diamond head shape, which is basically when the face shape is thin at top, where the distance between your forehead is about the same distance as your chin, but it widens out on your cheeks. And it doesn't have the heart face shape, where you have a large forehead, but it narrows down to a point. But the pear face shape is a bit of an odd face shape. It's basically where your forehead is thinner than your cheeks and your jawline. So it's just kind of like a pear. This typically indicates someone who's very creative, but this can also make them prone towards mental instability. This can also reflect someone who is potentially artistically brilliant, but once again, if you're hampered by mental instability, it's quickly going to denigrate their work. They are usually, due to the cheek volume, typically people with a lot of cheek volume tend to be sensitive. But with that sensitivity can come compassion, ideally just not misguided compassion, where it then turns into toxic empathy. They could become authors, artists, and work in the fine arts. But these, once again, are fields where, when they're constructively operated, are going to be wonderful spaces for growth and development. But when they welcome people who are unstable, they are basically unregistered insane asylums. Now, it's not currently on this chart, but as previously mentioned, I'm going to also go over the heart face shape and the diamond face shape. Now, with the diamond face shape, as previously mentioned, that has a prominent cheek volume. With prominent cheek volumes, they tend to be more on the sensitive side, but they're a bit more balanced as well, where their lower third is also very small, or at least narrows out, so they tend to kind of be still more realistic or practical in their approach towards their sensitivity. They tend to not try to loom on too many thoughts, so they tend to be more grounded in reality and practically rooted. And whenever there is a thought that does occur to them, they might hesitate to speak on it. And for the heart-shaped face shape, once again, because of the broad nature of their forehead and that being the biggest third, they tend to be very thoughtful. They tend to be very inspired. But they're also not someone who's likely to comment or speak on it. They tend to be known for being very soft-spoken. They typically have good volume in their cheeks, not enough to outweigh the size of their forehead. But personally, for me, I find this head shape to probably be the prettiest one, but that's a personal thing. Technically, the oval face is geometrically the prettiest one, but the heart face shape, to me, because of Christina Ricci, is just really pretty to me. It's just kind of like dainty. But yeah, it tends to have a lot of the same features as the round face shape, but with less emotional expression. They tend to be a bit more balanced just because of the high thought content and basically the think before you speak trait that's reflected in their face. So that captures, or that covers, the head shapes very simplistically. I'm going to go more in depth into the different ways that different cultures interpret physiognomy, because it's just a fascinating way to interpret people's facial types. But for now, I'm just going to use this chart, which is pretty simple. So the next one we're going to cover is going to be eye shapes, but that we will cover in a separate lesson. So for now, take care and bye-bye. So we're going to continue with our simple physiognomy check. Some people call it physiognomy, but GN in everything else, like Gnostic, is spelled, or pronounced rather, as like gnome, like the G is silent. So it makes sense that it's physiognomy, but that's just the way that I kind of read it in my head. I haven't double checked how it's properly pronounced. Nonetheless, we're going to continue with our examination of your eyes and what each different eye shape and eye position indicate of a person. So this is a very simple physiognomy check. It's not going to go too into detail to the degree that I like, but it'll get us by for now. Later on, we'll go into more detail. But in this case, I'm going to just take some measurements of your face, or your eyes rather. See if your outer corner is higher or lower than your inner corner. See how close the distance between your eyes are, particularly between each other and also from your ears. And then just seeing how large your eyes, or at least the whites of your eyes, are in comparison to the skin around them. Oftentimes it's the skin, your eyelids, that make your eyes look smaller or bigger. So I'm going to use the same tools I used before. Very simple, just kind of like little tools here. And I'm going to just go in and see according to what I can tell from your eyes, how I can measure out the inner and outer corner, it looks like for your left eye, it looks like your inner corner is a little bit higher than your outer corner. It's not too sloped, but it is slightly lower, probably like half a centimeter. I'm going to check the other eye, see if there's sort of a balance between them. Yeah, it's about half a centimeter. Your outer corner is about half a centimeter lower than your inner corner. And now I'm just going to check the width and length of your eye. I could tell that your eyes are quite large. They're on the larger side, or at least they look larger. Okay, excellent. Keep your eyes nice and open for me, please. I'm also going to examine your pupils and their relation, and your irises, and their relation to the sclera of your eyes. Okay, interesting. I'm just going to look at your pupils and your irises, and then your sclera. Okay, good. Okay. The reason I was looking at those different values is because your pupils, their position within your eyes, and their visibility are also values that we're going to examine your physiognomy on. So for example, it doesn't have it listed here, but for example, if you have sanpaku eyes, which is a Japanese definition of like how to read someone's emotional disposition, that means that there's white underneath your eyes visibly and naturally. So right now, if I look straight forward, there's not too much white underneath my eyes, but typically white underneath your eyes indicates someone who's seen tragedy, is very kind of numb, kind of like the Abraham Lincoln stare, where it's kind of like exhaustion, and sort of in Japanese philosophy, it could indicate someone who's going to have a premature passing. Someone who has whites visible above their eyes, much like this, is typically someone who is unpredictable and unhinged. So this could be someone that you can oftentimes see espousing philosophies that aren't in connection with reality. It's almost like they live in their own parallel delusional reality. You'll oftentimes see that their eyes have a lot of white at the very top of it, exposed. And then also, I don't know if it'll have a small touch on this philosophy, but if you have larger irises and pupils, well, if your pupils are small, but if your irises are large, then that indicates someone who is well-adjusted, but probably a bit more open-minded, and not open-minded in a way where you're willing to be deluded, but open-minded in the sense that you're still kind of exploring the world and observing what you see. If you tend to have smaller pupils, that indicates someone who's a bit more frazzled, someone who's a bit more on edge. If your pupils are dilated, as in they're large, then that could indicate someone who is not doing great, basically. But let's go according to the chart now. So I would say, according to the measurements that I observed of your eyes, you do have large irises, so that would put you in this category. Large irises as opposed to these small frazzled ones, which indicate higher levels of anxiety. And your eyes are more downturned, so they're more so right about here. Let's see. We're also going to examine if your if your eyes have vibrancy to them, or if they're quite dull. I would say, for example, that my eyes tend to be more on the dull side. This is something that can also be described as an M cell, where it's kind of like the Brie Larson stare. Typically, dull eyes will have kind of like a vacuous stare to them, kind of like they're numb. Meanwhile, sparkling eyes will have that sort of vibrancy to them, where it's still sort of more, not necessarily manic, because then that's more so like the anxiety kind of messaging, but rather They're just sort of like vibrant, kind of like a child excited to go to an amusement park kind of stare. They tend to be a little more enthusiastic about things. They're more excited, generally. So, your eyes are a bit on the middle. So they're not too numb, but they're also not necessarily sparkling, where it's like kind of men with ambition tend to have sparkling eyes. Typically, men who are very enraptured in philosophy or reading tend to have dull eyes. Men who are typically on the philandering side tend to have sparkling eyes. Men who tend to be a bit more intimately introverted tend to have dull eyes. Women who tend to be a little more idealistic and tend to be a little more optimistic tend to have sparkling eyes. Women who are a bit more introspective or critical tend to have dull eyes. So, in your case, you're kind of in the middle between them. So, typically, sparkling eyes, as observed right here, they're more full of life. They are fun-living and enthusiastic. They are a source of inspiration. They tend to be more benevolently influenced. So ironically, despite the fact that there is this sort of stigma in media and like social consciousness that people with sparkling eyes are somehow very judgmental, in reality they tend to be more charitable in their judgments than people with dull eyes. People with dull eyes automatically, typically, assume other people kind of have like a social debt, that there is something wrong with them, or that they'll judge them even before getting to know them with a negative social value. Particularly those who have sparkling eyes or who are more positive or optimistic in life, they will tend to judge them as being deluded. Meanwhile, someone with sparkling eyes tends to give people more benefits of the doubt from the start, or at least more mercy. And then they typically believe that life is full of happiness and joyful color. Now, typically also, someone with sparkling eyes can delve into someone with more manic eyes, depending on their life experiences. Now, someone with plain eyes is someone who is more apprehensive and worried in their nature, a little more neurotic. They typically are usually uncomfortable. These are people who oftentimes have the capacity to see themselves in a third-person point of view. So they tend to find themselves very kind of not necessarily comfortable in large groups. It is difficult for them to lead what is considered a more conventional or normal life, a more pro-social life with typical milestones. They usually consider a more traditional lifestyle as being foreign. And they believe that life is hazardous to live. They tend to succumb more so to nihilistic mindsets. They believe that there is no point to life and that either they will ascribe to absurdism to cope or nihilism to cope, sometimes even kind of adopting more of a Nietzschean point of view, where it's the strong man that succeeds, and if they feel weak in their temperament, they'll try to hide away as best as possible as a sort of survival technique. Now, to the shape of your eyes. You had more of a downward sloping eyes, so a negative canthal tilt. These type of more downturned eyes are kind of like Eeyore, or that one stuffed bear that had like really sad, droopy eyes. These people tend to have personality traits that fall in line with finding faults in others. So once again, they lack charity in their judgments. They tend to be more prone towards nagging or lecturing, scolding. They are typically, despite that fact, good assessors because they're not so charitable in their interpretations, and because they are someone who basically practices finding issues or faults. They are good analysts when it comes to people's negative traits. They are critical by nature, essentially. And they believe in judging one's integrity through faults. So it's kind of like that Wolf of Wall Street quote, where it's like, don't measure me by my wins, measure me by my losses. So they will assess your character based off of how many negatives you have or how much potential negatives you have, particularly in relation to them. Meanwhile, in contrast, we have the upward tilted eye, so a positive canthal tilt, which you do not possess. This is someone who is easy to get along with. They typically try to make the best of any situation with whoever is around. They are not judgmental in that respect, which might provoke someone to feel like, because of their lack of critical assessment of those around them, that they're not a genuine person, because only sincere people would then criticize those who are in their company. But because they're not critical, it shows that they are someone that gets along with everyone. Do you see the contrast here? Typically, these people are much more pleasurable to be around, depending on the temperament you find in someone who's a little more critical. They are generally non-critical. They just accept people as they generally are, typically. Of course, there are boundaries. It's not like they're, some hippie commune leader. There is standards, but they tend to be more capable of rising above those perhaps insecurities and knowing how to play along with someone that they find to be valid to criticize just because they want to get along with people. They're usually very clear and straightforward about their boundaries because they are in control of their environment. They do feel more dominant of the situation around them, hence why they have a positive canthal tilt. It's like hunter eyes. And they believe that we all learn from our mistakes, so they have a very free will oriented perspective, unlike the person who typically is more critical, who usually defaults with a more predestination type of mindset. And lastly, we have the iris shapes. So like with the pattern we've seen before, typically people with large irises, so typically like larger colors in their eyes, I suppose, they usually have difficulty in hiding their affections and emotions. They tend to be very expressive. They tend to be very vulnerable and open in that respect. They typically love to spread happiness all around them, or they tend to have an aura that spreads joy and safety to those around them. And they believe in giving smiles and receiving smiles. So they tend to have a countenance that just wants to get along and have good experience. They tend to be more trusting, not necessarily in their intimate life, but more trusting in general, where they will give their confidence more easily to others, building up a rapport over time. Meanwhile, in contrast, someone with small irises are usually more prone towards hiding their emotions, and they can be insensitive. They're usually more reserved and self-centered because they're very neurotic, so they tend to be someone who's a little more obsessed with their own self and how it can be interpreted in the public. And they believe that display of emotions is a waste of time, despite the fact that internally their emotions tend to be the most valuable thing to them, hence why their worldview revolves around them hiding it. So, in your case, you had large irises that were downward and also more on the plain side, I would say. So I would say you're probably growing a bit tired emotionally. You can sometimes be critical, but you remain optimistic as to that which you find. Because of your plain eyes, you sometimes have to dull yourself in order to process whatever it is that you find and whatever it is that you critique. But I would say a good remedy to keep in mind with this eye shape and type is to just give yourself some time to process and recuperate. Practice perhaps limiting your need to observe the world and instead sort of find a healthier space to feel like there is a personal utopia, basically, of your own creation, as a means to just revitalize yourself and regenerate. There's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with your dispositions, but I would say be wary of the pitfalls that might occur with them, which is just that you might numb yourself to an intense degree in order to not feel the pressure that comes with observing that which you're critiquing. Does that make sense? Excellent. Well, in that case, I hope you enjoyed your eye shape physiognomy check. For our next check, we're going to discuss your nose shape and see what qualities and characteristics we can derive from that. Once again, these are just simple checks. These are not rooted in anything a little more profound or detail-oriented. They're just sort of general. So, I'll see you next time, and take care. Bye-bye. Hello there. Looks like someone would like an analysis on their nose. Because the nose knows. So, once again, all of these little, like, physiognomy analyses are very, very simple. They're not going too into detail the way that it could when you examine physiognomy from, like, Chinese or Greek or other type of cultures throughout time. This is kind of like a more simple, kind of like heuristic kind of way of digesting physiognomy, where it's kind of like when you look at someone like for the first time. These are kind of like the immediate impressions that you get from this person. But yeah, anyways, so we're going to be measuring and analyzing the character of your nose and seeing how exactly it's interpreted. So, and what it means about your personality. So, let's see if I can find my little, like, there it is, perfect. I thought I lost it for a second. So, I'm going to be measuring your nose first. So, I'm going to put this to the side. I'm going to grab my other little fancy tool. I'm going to need you to look straight forward at me. Straight forward. Don't move. I'm going to just measure the depth of your nose. Okay, so you have a nose bridge. Excellent. See the angle of it. I'm just going to try and do like a little, I forgot what it was called. Like, oh my god, I'm stupid. I forgot what it was called. Like a compass, but it's not a compass. It's like the abacus, but it's not. What was a protractor? I can't remember. Anyways, I'm going to take the angle of your nose. So just to stay still for me, please. I just need to see what angle. Okay, yeah. I'm seeing kind of like a Roman quality to your nose, but I'm just going to analyze the tip. The tip is what determines if it's Roman or aquiline. So, or bulbous, honestly. So a bulbous nose, an aquiline nose is like kind of sharp. The tip points downwards, but it's not bulbous. It's very sharp. So it's like a John Lennon nose. It's like, and then the Roman nose is flat. So it's like strong bridge, but the tip itself doesn't pass the nostrils. Meanwhile, a bulbous nose is like Squidward, I guess. So I'm gonna just check the tip of your nose real quick and see. Yeah, I think it's more aquiline. So an aquiline nose has a thin bridge. So actually, I could tell that the bridge of your nose. See, there's like a little measuring tool here. You can't see it, you're freaking blind. So there's a little measuring tool here. So I'm just gonna determine the width of your nose real quick. Yeah. It's thin. You can just kind of like instinctually tell it's an aquiline nose. I just wanted to take the exact measurements just in case. But basically with an aquiline nose has a thin bridge, but from the side it is a bit prominent or sloped, but the most defining feature is just its pointed tip, but it has to be thin. The more Richard Nixon type of nose is a bulbous nose, kind of like the nose that Dan Aykroyd wore in that one movie with Chevy Chase and Demi Moore, Nothing But Trouble. It was renamed from like Vassylvania or something like that. Anyways, so a bulbous nose is going to be sloped as well, but it's going to look like this. It's going to be hideous. No aspersions or judgments. Now, we're going to examine each nose and what characteristics are associated with that nose. But first we're going to start with the aquiline nose, because that's the one that you have. The aquiline nose... I just have to decipher this on my own. Okay, so this is more so the aquiline nose. This one is more like Steve Carell. This nose right here, it's jutting out way too prominently. The bridge isn't really like the focal point. The tip of the nose is also extending. It's not really pointing downwards, but rather out. This is more of an aquiline nose. An aquiline nose has a very strong personality to it. Typically, a Roman nose denotes more intelligence and leadership qualities, but an aquiline nose also has a very strong personality to it. It can be imposing. It's typically someone who has kind of like a sharp eye for things around them. They typically are insightful and not necessarily abrasive, but they have the potential to be disagreeable when necessary. They're typically very independent, and they typically know how to basically assert their own sort of code. Roman noses have the same personality roughly, but they tend to be a little more less cerebral. I feel like aquiline noses tend to be a little more cerebral, even though Roman noses have like a connotation of intelligence to it, while the aquiline nose I feel really remains in the cerebral land. The aquiline nose, although intelligent, typically puts that intelligence to use, typically reminiscent of like Roman emperors. Let's see if there's an example of the Roman nose somewhere here. You absolute fools. What kind of a chart is this? This is why it's such a simple chart. It's such a simple chart. I wish I could find. We're literally gonna go through this series so many times with different assessments. Anyways, although the eagle nose is technically like the Roman nose, but this eagle nose is like not really the Roman nose because it's a little downward sloped and has like a bulbous tip to it. Like that's more like a Kazakian, a Kazakian, I think that's how you pronounce it, nose. It's like the nose that we will not go into anymore. So that nose is not the Roman nose. The Roman nose is more like this. It's like that. It's flatter at the end. It's like this. It's funny how they call it the eagle nose, but then they say that this nose is prone to cruelty and emotionless. Only if you're not in their tribe. So, now we move on to the simple nose. The simple nose, which I'm like, they call it the simple nose, but I forgot what the proper name of this nose is. It's basically a nose where the tip of the nose is kind of like upwards. The nostrils are visible, but the bridge is pretty pronounced, and the nose itself is long and slanted. This type of nose here is called the simple nose. They're bogus. So, simple nose kind of reflects someone who is unimpressive, simple but not noticeable. So it's like an NPC nose. It's the type of nose you get just because you kind of have like an amalgamation of different genetic compositions, most likely Anglo-Saxon, because this is, well, no, generally like, no. Actually, this could be very much just like pan-European, pan-Levant, pan-Levantine rather. Like literally this is just like a nose. Well, the next nose we're going to examine, well, that's the one that we already did, aquiline. Although they describe the aquiline nose, which is downward pointing nose, as harsh and rough, selfish and mean. Whoever made this chart is like, they mislabeled this one, but this one's true. But they mislabeled it. And then this one is aquiline, but then they were very, Anyways, this one is called the royal nose. Although this one kind of looks like the simple nose, except that the nostrils aren't so visible. It kind of looks like Kate Middleton's nose from the side, but Kate Middleton's nose is a snub nose. This doesn't really look like a snub nose because the bridge right here isn't concave enough. It's too flat. It kind of blends through, see? It just kind of blends through. Typically a snub nose will have more of a sharper angle here. but it indicates independence and imagination, according to this chart. Then we have the artistic nose, which looks like the snub nose, or at least we're getting there. This nose is kind of like more of a, what's her face? Carrie Mulligan, I think. The lady from a ton of movies that I can't recall. An Education, Suffragette, that one where I'm going to reserve my opinion on that one. So, this artistic nose is kind of like a pixie nose, is what I kind of liken it to. It's kind of like a Tinkerbell nose, where the tip of it is bulbous, where it's just kind of like, it's like a triangle instead of a line. And it indicates artistic temperament and signifies originality, which I do agree with. I've noticed that pattern too, where typically people with more of like a pixie nose, or like a short nose with a bulbous but yet snub tip, where it's like the tip of the nose faces upwards, you can see the nostrils, but the tip itself is still pretty bulbous. There's no like sleek or sharp lines to it. Those people tend to be pretty artistic. They tend to be like cosplayers or artists, like painters, just generally creative in general. Then we have the short nose. So the short nose, typically people with short noses aren't known for risk-taking and may not keep wealth, which is pretty reflective of, like, if you have a short nose, typically that's seen as a feminine trait, especially when the tip of the nose isn't aquiline or Roman. So that typically indicates someone who's not going to be sort of type A, forthright, just kind of used to injecting themselves into like leadership positions. But it doesn't describe the nature of the nose. It just describes the length of the nose, which is why I'm running into a lot of criticism with this chart. The next nose is the plump nose. This one's kind of like the snub nose, though. It reminds me of the artistic nose, but I guess this one's a bit more bulbous. See? This one is quite bulbous compared to this one. As you can see, this one's quite bulbous. That's not what it means. A plump nose, according to this chart, means that you are possessing worldly health and that you're a possessor of materialistic and spiritualistic wealth. Now, typically plump noses are like this. Plump noses like this, like those goblin noses, they're more so found in like middle-aged to older men who had like bad habits in their life. So typically like people who abuse the drink, you could say. This indicates poor health, actually, and it indicates someone who's been gluttonous, so their wealth dissipates. We're going to go through different charts during the series because I really like physiognomy. I really like it. I really, really like it. But this chart is actually like a little bit annoying sometimes. The next nose we have is called the good nose. That's funny. The good nose has a concave bridge, a snub tip, the nostrils are present. It's kind of like the sleek, it's like a sleek button nose, basically. It denotes, even though it's called the good nose, like it's literally called the good nose. But it indicates an inferiority complex, but suitable individuality. So it's like individuality that is accepted by others, as in like you're a conformist. Okay. This chart's just so off. Like, what kind of research did this chart do? I mean, the other ones are just so simple that they were just like, okay, nice. But this one's just like, is it because the nose is probably one of the more controversial facial features? Probably the most controversial facial feature to examine. Now, the next one we have is the feminine nose. But wouldn't this be the feminine nose? Like the button nose and the snub nose? Like, those are feminine noses, and typically the Roman nose and the aquiline nose are masculine noses. So, the feminine nose indicates strong character and great willpower. But yet, it's so similar to the royal nose and the good nose. And yet, those reflect imagination, inferiority complex. We move on to the next one. The sportsman nose. I myself am being a good sport about this. I'm being a good sportswoman about this. So, oh well. The sportsman nose, which is this one, it's like a bulbous nose, but from the front. How do you have different angles to this too? It's like, I could understand someone evaluating it based off the bridge, the concave, the tip, and all of that jazz from the side and all of it. But how do you have different angles and then say, oh, this is this one and this one's that one? It's like that one's the bulbous nose, but in a different direction. Or what is colloquially termed in the United States the Nixon nose, but in a different direction. Although this one's not really the Nixon nose, because you could still see the nostrils. Anyways, this nose indicates self-reliance and excels in the field of art. Then what's the artistic nose? Anyways, we have the matured nose. The matured nose is literally the good nose in a different angle. I see you. I know you. So here's the good nose, and then here's the matured nose. The only difference is the nasobonial crease on the cheek versus the lack of it here. This nose is attractive, well-formed, reflects someone who is attractive and has a well-formed character. Okay, and then we have the pointy nose. That one's funny. The pointy nose. The pointed nose reflects someone with good personality and is a good imitator. I feel like someone with the pointed nose, particularly in women, they typically have the qualities of a man with an aquiline nose, where it's like, to their limited capacity within a social context or a social group, which is typically the power that heavily is contained within the feminine, they're usually the ones to maintain social order, women with pointed noses. Meanwhile, men with aquiline noses will kind of combat or fight in individualistic settings for a sense of, like, setting the standard or rules. Then we have the manly nose, which looks like the aquiline nose yet again, but a thinner version of it. So here's the manly nose. And as you can see, the tip is pointed downwards. The nostrils are a little bit visible, but I think that's only because they're trying to show that the nostrils are there in the first place. And they call this one the manly nose, which they say reflects strong character and observation. Okay. And lastly, and most certainly least, we have the childish nose, which once again just, well, that one's kind of like a snub button-up nose. So the childish nose, which is kind of like the snub button-up nose, or a mix between the two, reflects inconsistency and a negative disposition. So, I hope you enjoyed that. I didn't. And for our next lesson, ideally, hopefully it won't be as poor as this one, we're going to be examining your lips. We will go through these separate charts again with different cultures, but for now I guess we'll stick with this one just because it's simple and kind of watered down. Anyways, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Okay, so now we're going to be discussing lip shape. So, in this lip shape chart, we have a large selection of options to choose from. These different lip shapes are going to reflect personality traits or character traits in you. As previously mentioned, the choices when it comes to these lip shapes aren't really that great. It's a very simple chart, a very simple physiognomy check. There are other scales that are far more insightful. But for now, we shall remain faithful and loyal and committed to this chart until it is done. So, let us first start with the very top. Actually, before we begin, I'm going to be taking some measurements of your lips. I'm going to be taking measurements of its width, and I'm also going to be taking measurements of each lip and seeing how thick it is. Okay? So stay still for me. I'm just going to take just a quick little measurement of the width of your lips like this, as such. Okay? Perfect. That's from one corner, then perfect. Okay. And then could you part your lip for me, please? Part your lips. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to take the measurement of this lip right here. Your bottom lip seems to be larger than your top lip, okay? And your top lip is a bit on the thinner side. Your bottom lip is full. Not too full. It's kind of like medium. But your top lip is a bit more on the thin side. Not completely non-existent, but it's on the thinner side. So as you get older, it'll probably start to disappear. So, and then if you have like a non-existent lip or a very, very thin top lip now, as you get older, it's gonna be one of those type of lips where it's like, it almost looks like the philtrum has kind of like folded in. It's interesting to see how the face changes with age. So, your lip shape, from what I can determine, is more along these lines. These are called the noticeable lips. Right here. Your top lip is a little bit thinner than your bottom lip. These lips are considered attractive. However, what I don't like about this chart is that it doesn't mention like downturned lips or wide lips where the corners of the lips exceed further beyond the pupils, which typically indicates someone who's a bit more vocal, someone who's a bit more extroverted, perhaps even eccentric or boisterous. People whose mouths tend to be smaller, a little bit shorter than your pupil, so those people tend to have those sort of like cherry plum lips, which is very desirable in Japan and I think South Korea. Those type of people typically have a more introverted, quiet disposition, but we'll go with this chart even though I'm highly dissatisfied with it and I have many critiques. So, these are called the attractive lips, apparently because they're the most attractive, even though it's like it doesn't reflect any character or personality traits, which is the whole point of physiognomy. Now, up here we have full lips as well. We have a full bottom lip with the top lip being a little bit thinner but still full. These are called professional lips, which once again I have to bring criticism to because I'm like, they're not. These type of lips indicate someone who is experienced and very tolerant. These are normal lips, so lips that are pretty much balanced between the top lip and the bottom lip. These are considered just ordinary NPC, kind of like normie lips. These lips are very prominent. These are like the type of lips that you almost assume someone got punched in the face and then their lips just completely swole up, or they lost a fight to like a bee, or like they decided to make out with a beehive and it started stinging their lips. These prominent lips indicate someone who is successful and commanding. Wow, you go get it, girl. Then these are experienced lips. They look a bit disgruntled. The corners of the lips look like they're wider than the pupils, but obviously there's no indication because they won't give you any indication. They also look a little bit downturned with a little negative indent right here in the cupid's tip, but then they have a positive tilt upwards in that direction. These lips are joyful and experienced. Can't you feel the joy from these lips? The next lips we have, or the next set of lips that we have, are the thoughtful lips. These lips look like Mae West's lips. They have sort of like an indent here, a little cupid's kiss or a cupid's bow, even though the cupid's bow is right there. And then they're full here, but there's a small indent. They're full on top. They kind of like blend together very well. These lips are observant and reserved. Then we have the complacent lips. These lips are in a smile. They look quite wide, so they look like they extend beyond the pupil. And then they're smiling, so they're showing their full set of teeth right here. So these teeth, or these lips, are satisfied and self-made. Then we have the extroverted lips. The extroverted lips look kind of like unsure of themselves. They look a bit confused, kind of like smiling but unsure of what they're smiling at. They are open-minded, which is typically the nature of what open-minded means nowadays, is just to accept that which confuses you and probably is not something you should be accepting. And then also passionate. Then we have the showing lips. The showing lips looks like someone who's unfortunately struggled or suffered through a neurological condition, a stroke. It's like there's paralysis here, and then there's just like emotion. Do you see what I mean? Like that. These are called the showing lips. They reflect impatience and disrespectfulness. Then we have the trusting lips. The trusting lips are two thin lips with a very stark cupid's bow, where the lip is highly indented, the top lip. These lips are trustworthy, warm, and kind. Then we have the generous lips. The generous lips are also just full lips, but they're smiling now. These lips are helping by their nature, and also they're broadly minded, meaning they have a healthy sense of curiosity and understanding. These are the friendly lips. These lips look like they're very tight in the corners, as if they're forcing a smile. They are sympathetic and responsive. Nice. Then we have the good-natured lips. This is someone who looks like a bee stung their top lip, kind of like Rosie Huntington. I always thought she kind of looked like someone whose photo would be like as victim status on a police department wall, because that does look like you got punched in the lip. So these good-natured lips are simple and likable in their nature, as you can see. Oh, there we go, right there. Then we have the positive lips. The positive lips have an upturn to their smile, unlike a downturn. These lips are ambitious, and they are known as achievers. Then we have the pressed lips. That looks like a banana but with a smile on it. These lips are abrupt and self-seeking in nature, so not to be trusted. And then we have the drooping lips, which are downturned lips, but these lips are very, very full. They are gloomy and lethargic, as you can see. So, this pretty much finalizes the simple physiognomy check for this session. I will not burden you any longer with this chart or these series of charts for. They burden me too. Now, thank you for accompanying me or joining me in my simple physiognomy check. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed, and